Oh, okay. We're live. Hi, Chris. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
To start the show, I would love to first of all thank you to be here, and then we're I also wanna thank for our sponsor. So this episode is brought to you by LG Nova. Get ready to ignite your passion for innovation at the fourth annual InnoFest, happening at the iconic Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco on September 25th and 26th. This two-day event brought to you by LG Nova is your chance to dive into the future with industry leaders and cutting edge startups shaping health tech, AI, clean tech, life science, smart life, mobility, and more. And here's something extra special. I'll be hosting a panel at InnoFest, guiding a dynamic discussion on the future of AI and the workforce. Join me along with other thought leaders as we explore the trends and technology driving innovation and positive change. Don't miss out on this unique opportunity to be part of the conversation and help create a brighter, more innovative tomorrow. Register today at innofest.lgnova.com and be part of the movement at the InnoFest 2024. Okay, so sorry about the commercial break at the very beginning, but loving our sponsor anyway. So let's dive into the conversation. So to
Mhm.
start the show, you are the co-founder of Netlify, which is a billion-dollar company now. And to start the show, I would love for the audience to learn more about you. So you moved from like an entire different continent to here, like Copenhagen. I will never pronounce it right, but like, okay, let's start
No,
there. And you were the chief digital officer of a company. Like, let's start with maybe what were some core lessons that you've learned early on in your career that you have took away to co-found Netlify?
well, yes, yeah, I did not have a straight path at all. So, back in the day in high school, I thought I was going to be a doctor. Figured that wasn't for me. I worked building computers, setting up office networks, stumbled into a movie studio, and ended up as a film editor. Did that for a number of years, line producing, stuff like that. Went to university to study film and media science. And while there, we sort of founded the first hybrid production company in Denmark when Flash video was a thing to do big, immersive, video-based websites. And we were the only company doing that in Denmark. And then the whole category blew up. And so we were sort of the only game in town. So did a lot of bells and whistles. It was all about award winning back then. Um, Wanted to get a little closer to the end client and do more strategic work and so on. So I sold it to a full service agency and I became the chief digital officer. Sort of left film behind quite quickly and just focused on digital productions, digital strategy for various kinds of enterprises, both B2B and B2C, and started sort of seeing uh, the web struggle. Right, there were at that point there was a lot of issues around security. There was a lot of issues. Like I remember the Drupal, right? When you
Mhm.
went to Drupal's homepage and it said if you haven't patched your site within 7 hours, you should consider yourself hacked. Well, if you missed that one, that would that wasn't great, right? And a lot of things like that. But all of this was premise of doing business, right? Like I mean, I didn't, you can use one software or the other, right? But that the web was struggling as a standard compared to apps and so on was not something I had imagined we could do something around. And then my friend, one of them from high school, my co-founder, reached out, and he was already in Silicon Valley with a startup, and sort of talked about sort of the nature of the architecture of the web. So regardless of you using one content management system or another, like the way it was built underneath it was essentially that it was like monolithic software that would run somewhere on some server and essentially built for every single visitor. And that is what exposed all the code running. It's what made it slow. It was really a bottleneck, right? It wouldn't scale very well. It's why we ended up with apps on phones instead of just websites, right? But there was something we could do about it, right? We could essentially decouple the presentation layers, the UX, the sites, what you navigate as a user in a store, in a website, in an app, from all the backend logic, right? And from all the systems you use as a private person, as a developer, as as a business on the back end. And by decoupling those things, all of a sudden it opened up for this notion that your website didn't have to run as a monolith on a server. No, it could be split out. The backend could be one place, but the site could be distributed with multiple points of origin. there was all these sort of technical revelations that sort of, once you really started thinking about it, became clear. Like, hey, this will be much more scalable, right? It's going to be much more secure because you're removing that large surface area of attack, and it's going to be much faster. And so I felt like, as an agency person, as a CDO, this was really something that the value proposition was super clear to me, right? Like saying, wow, this is great. But outside of that, it was also something that opened the door for developers in a new way, right? Front-end developers, they used to cut out Photoshop files and send it out for implementation. But today, today they are full-fledged. I don't think front-end developer really makes sense, because this is full-fledged app developers, right? Like, and full-fledged site developers. You can do so much more, right? Like with modern tooling. But back then, it really was isolated, and in these agencies and these companies, where you had control was your design, maybe your front end, like that, setting up the graphics essentially. But then you had to hand it over to IT, and a few months later, if you're lucky, something came back. It didn't really look like what you sent to them. There was a lot of back and forth, and that was really the headaches, right? Like, they were very much around that process, and this process would alleviate that, because the backend can be done by IT. But the actual properties now have been decoupled out and can be controlled by you. And so that the value proposition there was really much, much faster time to market. And that was the real sort of moment where I thought, okay, if this is the case, I have to make a go for it, right? Like, this is worth pursuing. This is a better internet for all, for developers, for companies, for end users. Like, this has to happen. And so we double clicked on it and saw that the reason it wasn't happening was that needed to become an ecosystem, right? You can't do commerce if all commerce solutions are only running as monoliths. But there also needed to be a platform that could tie these new components together. So if your back end and your front end and your different tools and services are not part of the same solution, how do they become a symphony? How do they sing together? And that's really the mission with Netlify, right? Creating a platform that ties all those disparate elements together. And so couldn't build the ecosystem, but we could at least give it the best conditions and circumstances as possible. And that would be by providing the platform. And so did that, came out in 2015 out of private beta. And it's been a ride, right? Today we have 5 million businesses and developers on the platform, and we run more than 50 million site stores and apps. And the category has gone from us and maybe another one or two other companies to thousands of companies. And I think like the vast majority, way more than 90% of all enterprises, also according to the Gartners and Forresters of the world, are building with this architecture now. This decouplement, this what we call Jamstack or composable, headless, right? This way of building has really become default.
Totally. I wonder, so like when you guys first started, since like for the audience who may not be technical, so like maybe many people talk about like, you know, other, maybe I don't know if you consider like Webflow a competitor, but I think like Webflow or like, you know, the Wix, Squarespace of the world are more towards like the consumer end, but I feel like Netlify is more towards like enterprise. You guys have clients like Google and like these like bigger companies. I wonder, so like when it comes to like doing the differentiation, I feel like maybe most people would leaning towards like primarily focusing on like the consumer, because there's like more of like free advertising, but like not a lot of people can actually break into the big tech or like the enterprise client base. What were like the like original strategy that you guys kind of like quickly landed all these like big names on the website?
I think that's an excellent question, right? I think what you're describing, those companies, they're site builders, right?
Yeah.
They're going to. I mean, I often refer people to that. If it's someone that says, you know what, it's my own idea. I'm not a developer. I don't have a budget. Like, is there a tool where I can easily do something myself? Or I can drag and drop something, a pre-selected template or something. And so essentially, they're sort of focusing on people that don't code. And of course, smaller, less sophisticated use cases. And it's really great they're there, right? I think it's wonderful. But you can almost imagine it, like the more you templatize something and make it easy to win or build, right? The more you're making choices on their behalf. I mean, that's what you're doing. That's a good thing. but those choices also are somewhat limited, right? And so by default, right, like it can't really be any different, right? And so it'll always cater a certain section of the market, but you can't go to a big enterprise and a $1 billion brand and say, no, you just like choose between those 10 templates. Like, yeah, well, maybe we want the whole brand to stand out a little bit, or we want to like control everything, and we have, huge requirements for how this fits into the rest of the stack and all these kinds of things, right? And I think that's why 70% of all these web productions are done by professional developers for themselves or for other people, right? Be it in enterprises or like externally, right? Like so either their own company of external clients. And so it was really obvious for us that those are the ones we had to empower. Also because those site builders, they have Super Bowl ads, right? Like they're differentiating not on technology, but on by marketing, right? Because you don't have a very technical audience. So if you come out and saying, well, we have the best cache validation in the world, that means a lot to an enterprise, right? Like Netlify has the best edge caching on the market, like including anyone, right? Like we have a very powerful story there, and it's a big driver for a lot of our users and our clients. It means nothing to someone that we consider using a traditional site builder, right? And to be honest, why should it mean something, right? Okay, so it's a little faster and so on, but they just want something live, right? We're not optimizing for a few milliseconds here and there, or whatever, right? Like it's not really the point at that point. So I think it sort of was a natural selection. Like what we wanted to build was the right workflows to enable an early motion towards a new architecture. And that's necessarily a developer bottom-up motion. And so I think from day one, we knew that we were never going to move into this sort of site builder tooling. And then now today, of course, it has developed, and we also have a visual editing tool that works across all the different content providers, which is really fascinating. But that's only because we're catering developers, and then we want them to be able to use this in a way that also contributes to how marketers will, they're also part of the stakeholders, right? That needs to be catered, and so we're doing that to some extent. But the traditional site builder audience is just so different.
I know another since I'm non-technical, but I'm aware of there's another company called Vercel that's very popular among developers. I wonder how do you guys kind of differentiate from each other, and for the audience who may not be super familiar, as well as in terms of go to market, I feel since we just talk about you guys compare to these consumer related products, but I feel to land I feel the Netlify strategy based on whatever I can tell, it's more towards land these big enterprise clients versus it sounds like it's more popular towards I guess the startup community. But I wonder how so since you're the expert here, what's your thought process on competing in the ecosystem in the long run? And would you say landing on the bigger logo first is more important than I guess community type of sales? I'm pretty sure you guys have a pretty solid community as well, and then you have did a lot of angel investing in the ecosystem as well. Just curious on what would be the strategy that you are thinking that will work out long term in terms of landing customers.
Well, I think first of all, I obviously can't speak to any other company strategies, right? I'll let them do that, of course, right? What I can say is that from our point of view, community building is extremely important, right? And I actually think that there's a lot of place out there that's trying to be very proprietary, even if it's open source based. It's sort of trying to lock you into a very certain way of doing things. And our focus on something like primitives on the edge is much more sort of saying it's not going to specifically rabbit hole around, let's say, a singular framework, right? It's much more going to support any framework and advanced functionality for those different frameworks, right? Making sure they're all first-class citizens, but building in a way that's a little more scalable. that it always could have been, right? And I think that also really ties into to our mission. I mean, so we're extremely born out of catering developers, right? Like, so that's also why there's 5 million that has joined us, right? Because if it was a pure enterprise play, those numbers wouldn't look like that, right? Obviously. And it still is, hard to imagine an easier place to deploy a blog, right? You click a button and you're essentially done. But it is true. We also want to make sure that this architecture is viable by making sure that we can cater the largest enterprises in the world. And their needs are, of course, a lot more complex. They're not just looking at sort of saying, how do we cater a headless singular project, a greenfield project. That was the challenge in the beginning, right? But today we have fantastic headless commerce offerings, right? And CMS, content management systems, and all the other players, like loyalty programs, you name it. They're API first, they're headless, they're part of this composable way of building, right? Today, I would say the ecosystem has evolved to a place where you can build anything. But there's a difference between building something greenfield and then having it coexist in a much larger setting inside enterprises, where they have tons of existing systems, and SAP and Oracle and Salesforce and you name it, right?
Mhm.
And so I think Netlify is also making sure that the workflows that we bring, the automation, the faster time to market, the performance and so on, can exist in a way that also supports all the existing technologies, right? So it can really help you not just build a headless project, but adopt composable architecture in general. And I think this is really key, because if you zoom out a little bit and talk about the value proposition, then what I see is that, I was in SIs, right, in agencies for many years. And regardless of who I sat with, if it was a CIO or a CTO or someone like that, regardless of what we were discussing, if it was a singular project, if it was more sort of like, 5-year plans, at the end of the day, I would always be helping them, or trying to help them with, what's the right solution for you? And those conversations have markedly changed. Today, I help them with, or try to help them with, and their prerogative is, how do I stay agile enough to be able to keep transforming? So digital transformation was sold as this is now happening, right? But the reality is, it's always happening, and it continues to happen. We have 10 times more services than we did 10 years ago, right? And this notion that with all the new digital touch points and with all the evolution and all the AI toolings coming out and so on, this notion that one platform will do it all for you, I think most CIOs, all the ones I ever speak to, would, and people in similar positions would say that's not the case, right? Like, so much more important than finding the right solution is saying, I need to be in a place where I'm agile and flexible enough that I can take a component, a tool, a service, use it with as little friction as possible. I need to integrate it into everything else, because everything sends back in forth data, right? You have observability, monitoring, logging, you have analytics, you have authentication across these things. Like, nothing really stands alone if you are in a place where you have sufficient complexity as you would in an enterprise, right? And so I need to be able to plug this in without too much overhead and without losing too much time to market. I need to be able to change it, update it, and so on, again, by the same parameters. But I also need to be able to discontinue it, not use it, right? Go and use something else instead, whether it's personalization tooling or whatever it is. And I think, and this is where it comes back to what Netlify is doing. If we were in there saying, no, we have the way for you to do it, it's that way. You have to use that commerce solution, or you have to use that framework, or whatever it might be, and we hang our hat on that, and we let's say, no, it's all about sort of a framework defined infrastructure, whatever it could be. But then we're prescribing a certain way. Then I'm selling the solution rather than selling the agility, and that's not the point. In Netlify, we really want to sell the agility, and so we focus on orchestration and operation. We focus on the glue layer, on the workflows, on the automation that necessarily is important. And again, just to put perspective on this, the last big shift we had, I mean, we collectively, all of us, was the move from on-prem to cloud. You can say that it's still happening in some places, but I also think it's fair to say it's been a pretty big mega trend for a number of years, right? And if you look at that, what that really is we got scalability, we got multitude of services, right? But we didn't get it was still operations as usual. Like it's, I go to AWS or whatever it might be, it's Home Depot. I can get all the building blocks I need, but I need to build it. I need to operate it and so on. And when you have a few dozen services and 1 or 2 digital touch points, that's much more likely to be viable. But when you have 30 touch points or something like that, and you have thousands of services, then the overhead of running this and having all these specialized database engineers and infrastructure engineers and all these, and they all have to come into play, even when you do something as simple as update your websites, right? That no longer works. And you'll often end up in all practicality with very slow time to market, very much overhead, it's very expensive, and a lot of silos, because at the end of the day, getting this to sync together is too much. And slow time to market, you'll stop doing basic best practices such as A/B testing and experimentation and personalization. Of the Fortune 500, 100% of them have invested in personalization tooling. More than 40% don't use it at all, which is not talked about so much, but absolutely crazy, right? It's because in all practicality, it takes too much, right? And it's too slow, and it just doesn't work well enough, right? And so what I think is it becomes so important, and I think it becomes the only viable path forward of saying, of course, I'm not going to choose one solution. I'm going to go composable. I'm going to mix and match these different services because I have to. But I also need to lean into automation. I also need to lean into next level workflows. I need to not think about this traditional infrastructure as something that I need to manually run and update and so on. I need to say that infrastructure layer, to the extent I can, I want someone to or something to run it for me, not as a managed service, but essentially by abstracting the infrastructure and operation and turning it into code. And that can't be too opinionated on the deeper parts of it, because if I was putting one commerce solution in front of you, well, that is not the point, right? The point is that you can mix and match and choose and evolve and all those things. And if you're locked into my flavor, and I'm going to prioritize in everything I do to keep you there, whether it's a framework or anything else, then the mission is not accomplished if the mission is to make sure that you overall are agile enough to run a modern stack and be composable without an overhead that makes it financially and time-wise not viable, right? That's Netlify's mission, to make sure that we can automate and take away as much of that maintenance, operation, orchestration as humanly possible, and let any enterprise sort of interconnect those things. And of course, the value of that becomes greater if you have more complexity. So in that way, you can say we're leaning to enterprises for sure. But this is very much also a question of pushing forward a bunch of developer tooling. Like we're working a lot with Astro.js, right, which is gaining tremendous traction right now, simply because we ended up in a place where front-end code became extremely complex. Like you could do so many things, but it was also becoming extremely complex, right? And I think like there's more and more of the smart developers that are out there saying, hey, this is too much, right? Like this doesn't make sense, right? Like give me a simpler, cleaner way to do this faster. And so you're starting seeing then solutions like that crop up, right? And so now more and more developers want to jump that way. But imagine if you couldn't, because you had sort of made a lot of priorities in how you run things that was sort of prohibited. That would be such a shame. And so again, our mission is not to decide for you what flavor of whatever tooling you need, but to make sure that it runs together with everything else.
I wonder, so like since I know that like from like I also want to like learn more about like, so since like you guys have landed like a Nike or Unilever, what's a different sales cycle when you're selling to like the technical team from like the consumer related, like the e-commerce companies versus a Riot game or like a Google, which is like more towards like people who are like tech savvy?
I think that's a great question, right? Because it is, I mean, it's one of those things I find super fascinating because it's changed, right? It really used to be once you sold enterprise software and the buyers, the check signers were, C-level, and they were a little removed from the tech, well, then that's who you're selling to. Like, so as long as it makes sense to them, you're good. That's no longer the case, right? Like if this is not viable for the developers, they're more than just influencers, right? Like they will absolutely be doing something. And I see that happening all the time. And so we are very often, even if it is a big deal, and we're dealing with people that are not touching or seeing code ever. The fact that we have so many developer champions inside the organization is super important, right? Like, I don't think there's been an enterprise call where we, with potential clients where there's not a developer somewhere there. Either they're relaying the story, or the person is there themselves saying, "Oh, I love Netlify. I use it for my own personal projects and so on." And those champions are important, right? Like, this is fantastic. First of all, it's lovely. It's heartwarming, right? That we could build something that someone could use for whatever, right? If it was personal projects, right? But that installs a lot of confidence high up in the organization. So I would say those are important, but of course they're not just the ones buying, and you have to live up to so many other things, including compliance and cycles, and how do how's your sales process like, right? Are you the ones that just come in fast and furious, burning bridges, giving them an offer that they take it or leave it, right? Or are you working with them, right? And that's actually really important, right? Like being commendable and really seeing it as, hey, like this, we have joint stakes in making this work, and that goes before the sale, but it very much also goes after, right? And so I think like that's really important to us, right? And to make sure that we have a really, really solid motion there in both pre-sales engineering, post-sales engineering, success, and so on, right? But of course, there is a difference between if it's a small organization and it's just a developer choosing, right? It becomes very much sort of about technical capabilities and can we do this and that, and of course a price. And I think like once you're dealing with large organizations, that just more stakeholders, and that means there's more flavors here, right? And again, things like compliance and SLAs and all these things will play a different role. But also, I would say our ability to come in and be a strategic partner. That's very much often it, right? Like, so of course, Netlify will be part of the solution, but it's, I mean, as I've been explaining, right, it's a platform that ties together all these other things. And so, if we didn't have an opinion on those, if we weren't able to help choose those, help plan migration paths and all those things, I don't think we would be very successful when it comes to larger enterprises, right? Being a good strategic partner and helping them make the right decisions, not because we have invested in like you should go this way or that way, right? But just by we've done it 5 million times, right? Or 50 actually at this point. And so of course we have a lot of know-how, we have a lot of use cases, more than anyone else in the market ever, because we were the first ones to be there doing this kind of work, right? And so I think that becomes incredibly important in those larger deals, right? But you know this, and I'm sure no matter what funnel and how technical it is, right? Like this notion of understanding different stakeholders have different problems, success looks differently. You have to identify what success looks like for the individual. I don't think whether I was selling shoes on Netlify or consultancy services, I think that's super uniform, right? Like that goes for all of us, right? Understand the problems and what success looks like. That's Alpha Omega. And that changes depending on whether you're a front-end developer or you're balancing up a multi-billion-dollar budget as CIO.
I wonder, so I was thinking like I feel like when nowadays like I feel like there's a lot of people focusing on like community selling to like engineers. So basically bottoms up as like, maybe a lot of like open source project is happening where people can just like use as like a freemium. So like basically people start using it and then later on like people start paying. What's your thought process on like open source related companies? And also, like, I saw that, like, obviously you guys have a Netlify Jamstack Innovation Fund. Can you share a little bit more about, like, what is your investing strategy in that aspect from like angel investing to investing out of the ecosystem fund?
Yes. Okay. So there's a few questions rolled up in that. Like, so first, open source, hugely important, right? Like we have tons of contributions to open source. We have many people hired that just worked on open source projects. I think open source is incredibly important. It surprised me to see how it's developed over the last 10 years, because 10 years ago, you could absolutely have commercial backers of open source projects. And you can also have people that did a open source project and built companies around it. But if it had popularity with the community would never allow the project to be sort of pigeonholed into only support a commercial platform. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we've seen. And I mean that kind of broadly, right? We've seen it just in general. So I think open source is struggling a little bit from, you have these open source projects, but they're extremely selective on who do they take pull requests from, and it only has one purpose, and that's as a vehicle for a commercial entity. And that means, for example, like what it can mean, and often does mean, is that a lot of choices are made that's not good for the product experience, but it is good for the commercial vendor because it tries to increase further lock-in. And I think that's a shame, right? It wouldn't have happened 10 years ago because there would have been a great pushback, right? And there's a lot of examples on that. At the same time, I also think that open source needs to be able to be monetizable. The people that work there, how do you actually help them, right? I mean, today, I think it's a great path forward for a lot of developers that have made a lot of money later on, either doing their own thing or working in companies. Part of their educational journey has been to contribute to open source projects and so on, right? And so I think open source plays a huge role in not just modern software, but almost like sort of as today, most business problems have digital solutions. Any company is a digital company almost by default, right? And so you can't really just say software, right? Like, and I think open source is simply a big part of society, right? And so it matters how we handle it. So yes, open source is incredibly important. I think there's so many different challenges, right? Like sometimes you'll see someone do an open source project, and also wanting to build a business around it, but never really considered like how would it be commercialized, right? And then it becomes an afterthought. And I think from a venture point of view also, that can sometimes be hard, right? Because do you necessarily equate traction to monetizability? When is the monetizability, as we talked about, something where you sort of risk sort of strangling the project a little bit? And when can you do it in a way where you can also partner with other commercial entities and push it forward that way? And so for open source, it's a complex equation. It's extremely important, though, that we keep collectively working at it and making sure it doesn't go away. And then what was the next question? That was the sort of the notion of investing into the ecosystem, right? So my co-founder and I, we started almost immediately investing into other companies in the emerging ecosystem. And that was because we needed one, right? Again, there was no headless commercial, commerce offerings or anything, not really out there, And so having that prosper and blossom was super important. And so we were doing that. And then at some point we thought, what if we allocated a bit of budget and then started putting that into to startups directly. And with that, sort of try to help out a little bit by building out a program where we could also, share best practices of scaling the organization, whatever else you would do. You obviously typically see that in an accelerator. Now, this is not our business, so it's not a huge accelerator program. Like we're not trying to be Y Combinator or something like that, right? But it was a little added value add. And again, it wasn't really sort of a strategic arm of let's make money in a new way at all. It was much more of a let's push forward an even healthier ecosystem and see how much we can supercharge it. So that was our perspective.
Totally. I wonder, so basically for the ecosystem fund, is that investing in so from my understanding, based off searching some of your portfolio companies, so the ecosystem fund is towards other partners who are in the ecosystem, not potential clients or people who are building up a website on Netlify.
No, I mean, often we'll partner with them, right? But no, that was not the intention, right? It is something that creates a healthy ecosystem. Again, we exist really as an operating and orchestration glue layer that ties together all these modern solutions. And so these modern solutions being backend as a service platforms, right? Like it being, payment gateways, being whatever it is, right? Like there's so many examples out there, and so we have an interest in pushing that forward. And that's sort of why we did it. And of course, you often are able to create some good relationships with the companies that you're involved in, right? And you spend a little bit more time with them, right? And so you sync a little bit. And I think one thing that's important here is that to understand that we talked about in the beginning of this conversation about monoliths, right?
Mhm.
And those are very typically cyclistic. And I'm not just talking about the web, but generally speaking, when it comes to software, right? We go from monolith, and then we get sort of annoyed by everything is a single vendor. And if I want to change one thing, I have to change 36 things, and it'll take forever, and it's too slow. And let's decentralize. And then
Mhm.
when you decentralize, you're like, oh, this is not a holistic experience. These things don't plug and play well enough together, and so on. Let's try to get one vendor again. And so it goes in this cycle. And I think today the difference this time around when it comes to the web and so on is there's so many different services, and the advancement, especially now with AI, is too fast. There is no platform that's going to do this to you, right? Do everything for you. So you necessarily have to go composable, right? And if you go back to a monolith because you felt you had to, then you're winning, you're losing out, right? And that's such a shame. And so we as an ecosystem have to be able to look past our own commercial interest as individual players. We have to look at standards. So I'm involved in the MACH Alliance, currently wrapping up my tenure on the executive board. And the things that I think I've been most involved in there is interoperability standards, right? This notion of making it easy for these different parts of a solution to be joined together at the hip, so the enterprises or the end clients can feel like, yes, I have interchangeable parts. I might have different vendors, but this feels or operates close to a holistic solution, right? And so this goes for large DXPs that would traditionally be bought by marketing, but also to sort of much more technical and infrastructure focused solutions as well, right? This notion that you're going to have to mix and match different vendors is here hopefully to stay, I would say, right? Because that's, again, back to this notion of hey, if I can, then I can gradually transform all the time rather than doing it in these huge steps, right? So I can keep all the advantages of composable. But it requires that we work together well, right? And so working together well is talking as well, like discussing, like, hey, how are you fetching this data? How are you sending this? Like, how do you to operate there? And I do think that we have a very central position there, and have had it longer than anyone else in having those conversations and making sure, to the extent that we're able to at least, have a similar thinking, right? And it's not a commercial advantage for anyone in particular. It's sort of, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? And that's the notion here, right? It's not something that's better for one player than the other. It's just the notion of, if you're in this ecosystem, then we all gain from making it as easy as possible to mix and match. And we can, of course, do individual integrations into different platforms, and that's great, right? But the adherence to certain standards is also going to be really important moving forward.
I wonder, so like, how do you think about like, so I want to probably jump into like another big topic, which is AI these days. Like,
Mhm.
um, how will that shape the entire ecosystem in web development? And like, I feel like it's a buzzword now. Like, I mean, like, people are joking like, nowadays, like every company's an AI company and like, who is an AI founder. But I wonder what are your thoughts on like, what would be like some call it like three core things that will change in the next 10 years in the web development space? And how do you feel like your company, as well as like some of these other maybe like people you have invested in, should kind of adapt into the new technology?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I think first answer is really fast, right? Like it changes at incredible speed. Like, I don't think we need to talk about a 10-year timeline. It's much less than that, right? I think so many things, right? I think the traditional way we do front-end frameworks is going to change and feel really obsolete in a few years, right? Because I think AI is going to come in both to help code, right? But you're also going to have different visual tools becoming much more of having native code as it. Like, you think of a Figma and a VS Code in one, right? Like this notion of designers not being able to just hand over a design, but even without a site builder, being able to do live edits and so on, right? Because the design is code. And I think that's also going to be utilized with AI. I think in essence, what I'm saying is that I think that the front end space is going to change tremendously, right?
Mhm.
And we've always had very high iteration there anyway, so it makes sense that that's where it's going to happen. I think if you have an ERP, it'll have new functionality, but it's one of those things that is a very heavy lift to change it. So that's one of the things that are more stable, right? It might take a little longer to make changes there. Maybe how you treat this and the layers on top of it, but the ERP itself, right, is just more cumbersome to change than a flavor of whatever shortcut you use to end up with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right, which is essentially what these modern frameworks do for front end. But so I think that's changing tremendously, right? I think a lot of web developers we've always been abstracting up, right? So 25, 35 years ago, it was a very significant percentage of all developers that knew machine code, right? And I think now it's I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it's way less than 1%, right? 0 point something. And so that's not because there's fewer developers, right? That's just because we abstracted that away. Like something else will do that translation for us. And I think AI, especially in its current form, that's how I think of it, right? It's not intelligent enough to just create a lot of the websites for us, but I think a developer can come in and saying, hey, I need this, I need this, I need this, right? So you still need the developer's context understanding to create these things. And then I think they'll be much more focusing on providing the right assertions for, do all these 1,700 ways of how we do authentication and all these other things, right? Like they prompt it in and make sure that that's the framework that the code generating AI will do for you, right? So I think the developer will also abstract up to a different position, but that position didn't really exist before, right? So I do think that if you stay put, it might get really hard, right? Because AI might be doing a bunch of your work that you're doing today, but then you could say the same if you are doing the exact same thing as you did 10 years ago. In most cases, you'll also be quite obsolete with limited job opportunities, right? So I do think that we're going to see that move. And then I think as far as how we're catering it, it's exactly the same thing, right? In noting things are moving so fast that thinking that we will have the right agent that everyone will use is a little naive, right? We do have a bunch of things, like, for example, if you build your site, like it's a command to compile, right? And it will run in the background, and then we're able to give you, if you build failed, we have used AI to look at this is probably why it failed, and these are the 3 things you can do to fix it. Like it actually comes together with the error message, right? And so these kinds of things are super helpful for developers, and we'll do more of that. But otherwise, our notion is how do we be the best partner for agents? Because the agents also need the right infrastructure and the right plumbing and so on when they're deployed to help companies. And so for us, it's more sort of, we've always been abstracting away manual work and making it automated, so you didn't have to worry about it anymore. And I think especially generative AI is all about continuing that journey. It's taking something that used to be manual. It's not that you couldn't do it. It's just the cost overhead, and now it's doing it for you. And then I think outside of that, if you can easily imagine as a last step, but that will take some time. I don't know how long, right? But if you have agents just doing all the coding for you, then every programming language that's ever been invented has been invented for as a set of rules for someone else to follow, a human to follow, right? Like, and I think you could easily imagine programming languages and ways of coding that, because it's done by an AI, doesn't have to stick and adhere to the same parameters as existing programming language today. And that might be a real differentiator, like, and a real true change, and not just about automating something that used to be manual, but introducing new standards. But I think we're a little bit from that as of yet.
I wonder, so like speaking of, since you mentioned about like a lot of like the front end development are going to be replaced by AI, what are like some,
At least, right?
yeah, so like I wonder what would be the things that people should build a skill on. So like for example, if I'm uh a person who is like trying to learn about like coding as well as like all the technology in the backends today, what language should I start first? And then like from how do you educate yourself for the future? Since like some of the code, since like every day we're hearing like the Davin will just replace all the color anyway. So what is this gonna kind of like look like for the future? And then like what kind of skill, like obviously people are talking about prompt engineering, like what would be the skill that you need for the future of building a SaaS company?
You're putting me on the spot here, but it's a very good question. I think like I'm going to refrain from recommended programming languages, right? Because I don't know, and it's tough, right? I very well be wrong, but I think you said it yourself, right? Like this notion that prompt engineering is going to be a thing. That I think to be good at that, it requires for a while yet, at the very least, and quite a while, you to understand what's actually being made. Like, if you just said to a marketing coordinator somewhere, like, hey, sort of, how do you want to instruct your code generator to handle this authentication? They're like, the authentic what? Like, what do you mean? Like, like that I need to be able to log in. Like, that doesn't, like, it's not something you can just have someone say, I would like a website, please, right? There's so much more to it. And I think that only comes from having an understanding of functional programming languages and how these things work. And so without putting a specific flavor on the programming language, I think understanding code and coding will still be super helpful, right? And I still think can be a huge advantage, right? Because that's going to enable you to be a meaningful prompt engineer, to be, yeah.
So for like, since like we talk about like building a successful community, what does that mean for building a successful developer community to you? And how, like, so for example, if we were building like a company, if we're building like a SaaS company, since a lot of the founders are listening to the podcast, like maybe they're building a SaaS company, and then what's your advice on like building a vibrant community? Does this mean like people adding each other on Slack and then like, looking at the GitHub star or something? I don't know. Like, how do you like, where do you like, what does that mean to like build a vibrant community around your projects? And like, does this means like a developer conference every year to like chat with people who are building on there, or like what does that kind of like look like for you?
I think first of all, the community is about like a place, or not a place, but many places necessarily, but an exchange of ideas between members of the community. That's what defines it, right? Like we have a joint project and we talk about it together, right? Like, and that project can be very abstract, right? And you can have a community where there's many different conversations that are somehow contained in the same platform, but or sphere or whatever it might be, but not directly related, right? But still, like there is some sort of joint mission and there's some sort of exchange of ideas, right? Because although it's not a community if you just speak into it, it's not a community like Wikipedia can be updated, but if you're just a user, it's not like a user community. If I just go and read articles, right? That's just a resource, and it's a great resource, but that's not a community as such, right? There might be another community around it, but not from just going and reading. And so there has to be an exchange. And so I think that exchange can happen in so many different ways. And so for example, for us, we had to not just create a community or even an ecosystem, but a category, right? There was this notion of, hey, there's a list of best practices that we sort of try to come up with. And if you follow these, well, then you can actually have these decoupled web experiences and so on, right? And so, they were already existing. Let's say Twilio and Stripe were there, right? Their APIs, right? Their services that you can use where their output is not a website, essentially, right? GitHub and using Git rather than just FTPing files up was part of this, right? But they didn't identify as part of this movement up early on, right? But they were, right? And because there was playing roles in it, right? And so I think what we tried to do back then was talk about sort of what are the boundaries of this, right? Like what's included, what are the best practices, and then try to share the gospel of like, hey, if you think of architecture in this broader way, right, then you can really do something neat, and you can get to market and produce things really, really fast, and you can get like global distribution that was reserved from the Facebooks and Googles of the world 2 years ago. Now, like you can have it on your free site, right? Like you can, like there's all these things you can do if you use this tooling. And I think what we then did was sort of like, for example, staticgen.com was the largest site generator, like largest public directory in the world of site generators, right? And you had all these creators submit their different site generator projects and frameworks, right? And then we can use that for conversation, but it also became a place where people could link to and say, hey, like, here's a list. And so it's a list of something. So it becomes a thing. They're not just separate entities. They're all part of something that fits a modern way of building digital applications. And so you sort of slowly start creating an understanding of, this is a thing, this is an architecture, we live in this. I'm interested in furthering my knowledge or my output or whatever within this area. And so now there's sort of a starting to be a bit of a joint mission there. And then there's the communities, which can, for example, be meetups all over, right? We also had a conference every year, we still do. But back then it was really focused on just the sort of the nascent sort of notion of an ecosystem, bringing all these different players together. You can have discourse forums, which we also do, right? And have had and run, and Slack channels and so on. So sometimes it's a place, sometimes it's many different places, right? But is the headline the same? Like, do you have a joint mission and something that you exchange within that, right? And I think that's the community, right? Like, you have to sort of define what it is you want to talk about, and then there can be so many places of doing it. And most conversations are still going to be across lunch tables. Early that's how we came into enterprises, right? It was just developers using it for personal projects, finding out that their friends were doing it at work, starting talking about it at lunch, right? And convincing some engineering manager to please let us deploy this internal documentation site in this way because it's so fun and easy. And then they come, see, I'm already done. And then the engineering manager, oh, okay, maybe we can use it for this side as well. And then you sort of grow. It's the typical bottom-up story, right? But that very much came out of that community, if you will.
For sure. I wonder, since like there's some of like the listeners are investors in the space, I'm sure
Yeah.
they're curious about your take on, like, what would be a really interesting like subsector, or like in the SaaS space that you feel like are gonna have a lot of like unicorn popping up. And like, what's your thought process on, like, you know where they're gonna come from, and like how do you quickly identify which project would kind of like took off?
I mean, I've also done a ton of angel investment by now, and I do a lot of advisory and board work and so on, right? And so, I have a ton of exposure to the ecosystem, and so, like, there are many. I'm gonna say the same as anyone, right? Where AI is obviously a huge thing here, right? And the
Would
more
it
that
be like DevTool, Copilot, or like AI agent? Like, what would you say it would be like
Yeah, I think like
you find
like
interesting?
I believe, especially in the first iterations here that we're going to see over the next years, is that it's not that dev tooling goes away, like the developers is replaced. I think the dev tooling is what becomes updated, right? So it's the developer that just has better tooling available, right? It's the
Mhm.
developer using a Copilot or Devon AI, Find Dev, or whatever, right? They're the ones using this as a tool for them to be more productive, right? And so I think that's the first bet, right? Is that I don't think it's about the developer being replaced immediately. I think it's about the dev tooling evolving. And of course, it always has, but now it has, like in the last couple of years, it's really accelerating. And so that's one thing, right? And then I think all the classic disciplines of, like, databases, where we're both going to get like new levels of distribution and caching, but also, serverless and traditional databases and data storage and so on, right? Like, I think melding more together, right? It's going to be faster and faster. I think you're going to see a lot of tooling supporting a new way of building digital experiences, which is going to be more conversational, I believe. Right now, it's very much the notion that you come into a site, and it's actually important that most people see the same site, right? So, and then you might do some experimentation and personalization. We already talked about that it's sort of limited in reality of how much that's actually happening. But I think with AI, I think we're going to lean into an era where 100,000 visitors at the end of it is going to have 100,000 different experiences. And I think it's going to be okay, because the experience is going to be more conversational and less just about presenting static information. So I think companies that sort of push into that space are going to be there's going to be some relevant big winners there for sure. I also think this notion of, in general, if you look at the big aggregators, like, let's say Google, right? already, if I search the weather, I'm not going to be redirected to the weather channel. Like Google will just tell me up top, right? Same with plane tickets, a bunch of other things. But I think with AI, what you're going to see is that so much of the experience is going to move out in the step of the aggregator. The problem there is that it's very hard to brand differentiate. So I think these sites that have just been communicating information today, which has been, I mean, like, been part of that story myself. Like, how do we get the cleanest, fastest way to and the easiest, most straight customer journey? Let the customer, get there as fast as possible, right? Just give them the information and that's it. But I also think there's going to be a little bit of a counter movement now, where over the next years, it's going to be more important to add something to the experience that you can't get, because with social commerce and everything else, you sort of, where are you going to build that relationship, right? It's hard to build a relationship, even if you are top hit in Google. You might sell something, but you also want to create something a little deeper, right? Like, everything, the loyalty programs are there for a reason, right? Like we do all the things we can to create a relationship with a brand or client, right? And I think the name of the game changes a little bit if all our interactions is actually done somewhere in third party, where we have no or very little control. And so I think that's going to be really interesting, right? How is that combated? What tooling comes out to support ever more immersive experiences, right? I think Netlify, of course, want to be a part of that equation for sure. But I think there's other tooling there in the personalization space that's less about sort of cookies and all those things, much more about the notion of how do I create personalized real-time sessions, right? So your behavior immediately will lead to differentiated experience as you go through the customer journey on the website. And so I think, like, and we could keep this list going, right? Because I think, like, there's a lot of things. As I said, I really believe that digital design is going to have to be natively code. I think those two things are going to be the one and the same. And so there can be existing players having takes on this. They're definitely building that way. There could also be new players. It's going to happen, and it has to happen, right? I also think there's some animation standards right now that, like, the death of Flash more than a decade ago hasn't really been replaced. There has to be something there. There has to be someone coming out to solve that at some point, right? And so on. Like, the list is long, and at the end of it, all of it will be replaced by newer and better solutions, right? Either by existing players or new ones. And then you have, brand new categories, right? Of course, anyone cracks AGI for real, that's probably a good investment. But yeah.
Amazing. So I want to end with like a quick 1 minute fire round. I want to be mindful of the time. So, what's your favorite book?
My what? Sorry.
Favorite book?
Favorite book? Oh my goodness. Does it have to be business related or just in general?
In general.
Okay. I think A Fine Balance by Ronson Mystery was a book that very much stayed with me. It's still with me, right? But it really stayed with me for a long, long time. And so if that's an indicator of a good book, and I think to some extent you can argue that it is, then at least that's right up there.
What's your information diet look like?
My information
Diet.
diet.
Yeah,
Diet.
basically, like, what are something that you use to like keep yourself on track with like everything at work, or like, so like basically, do you read newsletter, or like is there um like a news outlet that you constantly subscribe to, basically?
I have ADHD, and so I just consume information rapidly at all times, all the time. I can't help myself, right? So everything, all of it. So I think, like, there's so many short form avenues, right? Like, so one thing, it's not an information diet as such, but I think we all do well to remember to practice reading and retaining and concentrating enough to do long form as well. Because I do think that are things that don't get that get a little lost in translation if we're only reading headlines. And I know that for myself as well, right? And so I think, like, sometimes I'll have an immediate opinion on something, right? But I can feel that it's too shallow, right? I haven't dug depth enough, because I feel I have a bunch of information, because it's not just I read one headline, I read a lot of them, but they were all kind of headlines, right? And so the notion of concentrating enough to do long form and retaining information from that will give you a perspective that you otherwise could miss, right? And so I think that is a little important to do as well. But I don't think there's specific newsletters or something like that. I think a lot of the places where we get our information via search engines, directly in social media, websites and so on, they're almost all of those aggregators, they're very sort of behavioral in your targeting. So they also tend to start listing, using the algorithms to give you a bunch of stuff that you might be interested in, right? So I often think that those aggregators, I put in the work for them to recommend things that are relevant for me. So yes, it is personalization and so on, right, for them, and retargeting. But you know, I may, you know, for me, it works to my advantage. I feel like, you know, show me what I want to see. That's okay, you know. Yeah, so I think that's important. And then I also think that if you pigeonhole with a certain media, whatever it is, whether it's for politics or tech or whatever, just remember sometimes to read the stuff that you would feel like I don't agree with. Just a little bit of sanity checking, or just remind yourself that there's an opposing view. Not that you have to agree with the opposing view at all, right? But that's one thing I try to do. If I feel that I spent too much time from a single source, I sometimes like to just click into a source that would sort of come at it from a different angle. Just, I don't know, it helps with my perspective, I feel. And that goes in business, but it most definitely goes for all the stuff I consume.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
The biggest impact, that too many people, right? I mean, obviously, my co-founder here, right, of Netlify, obviously we have quite the story together, and that was a big impact, as when he reached out originally talking about this thing that could be solved, the architecture of the web. And there's been plenty of people, right? From my old high school teacher, Nulle, like he I think he had ADHD as well. I'm not going to diagnose him live here, right? But I remember him being really enthusiastic, and I just remember that his way of jumping around between things fit me perfectly, and I loved the enthusiasm, and I retained everything he said because his energy was so infectious, and it taught me that's how I learn. That's who I need to surround myself with. Those are my people. I need more of that. And so that was really sort of shining a light for when I was struggling retaining information, or learning something, or motivating myself, right? I learned how I clicked and how I learned. And obviously that has been extremely instrumental in everything I've done since then. So that was quite influential as well. And then, you know, as a founder and with any kind of success, and especially in a place like Silicon Valley, you get to meet fantastically smart people. And you know this, right? And so, like, I feel like it's not one of them, but all of them together is something that's it's
I like that ecosystem.
It really is.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh, who would I invite to a dinner party? People that fit the profile we just talked about, that are excited, and positive, and like to share, right? There's so many brains I'd like to pick. Kurt Vonnegut would probably be fun to have at a dinner party, and so would like so many others. Like, I don't know, like I'm blanking right now. I'm just thinking, yeah, there's a lot of people that would be fun to have at a dinner party, right? Yeah.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Ooh, where can you find me outside of work? Yeah, so I like a lot of different things. I love art and architecture and nature, and one thing I do love is racing as well. It's fun to drive fast. I think it's an ADHD thing. So when you're on a track and you're racing, you sort of have to be very focused. And so I don't have to put in effort to be focused, because it happens naturally. If you're driving fast towards a turn, your brain just takes over and says, hey, let's focus on not dying. And so that becomes really easy. So it's actually a very serene place for me to be, because it's where a few times where I can focus without having to try too hard to do so.
Amazing. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was a fun conversation, and I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this was fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me quickly